You know, back in the summer of 1914, the world just kind of stumbled into a war that would change everything. I'm not just talking about redrawing maps. This conflict would redefine what war even is. It wasn't just another war. It was a complete rupture in history, a catastrophe so huge we're still feeling its aftershocks today.
Think about that phrase for a second, the foundational catastrophe. That's what historians call it. And honestly, when you start to look at the sheer mind-boggling scale of the devastation, it's pretty hard to argue with them.
I mean, the human cost was just staggering. Look at this. 4 massive ancient empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the Ottoman, and the German, they all just crumbled into dust. And the death toll? Over 21 million people, gone, soldiers and civilians. This war didn't just create casualties, it literally consumed an entire generation.
So you have to ask, right? How does a regional crisis in a place like the Balkans manage to ignite a global firestorm? Well, the truth is, the whole continent was already a powder keg, just sitting there, divided by suspicion and armed to the absolute teeth.
By 1914, Europe was basically split into 2 giant armed camps. You had the Triple Alliance, the Central Powers, with Germany's industrial might at its core, and on the other side, the Triple Entente, the Allied powers. Now, these alliances were supposed to keep the peace, through a balance of power. But what they really created was a tripwire. An attack on one country meant an attack on all of them.
And this is where it gets really interesting when you look at the numbers. At a glance, you'd think the Allies had a huge advantage. More soldiers, way more battleships. But then you look at steel production. Germany was an industrial powerhouse. And that strength, plus their incredibly disciplined army, meant the Central Powers could punch way, way above their weight. It kind of neutralized the Allies' advantage in sheer numbers.
So you have this whole continent, tense, ready to explode, and all it needed was a single spark. And that spark came right here, in Sarajevo. The assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That was the one event that pulled the tripwire and started a chain reaction that nobody could stop.
You know, the craziest part is, everyone thought this would be a quick, glorious little war. The soldiers marching off in August 1914, they famously said they'd be home by Christmas. But that idea, it shattered against the brutal, bloody reality of modern industrial warfare.
So Germany had this big idea, the Schlieffen Plan. The goal was to swing through neutral Belgium, knock France out of the war fast, and then turn to deal with Russia. But it didn't quite work out. They were stopped cold at the Battle of the Marne. That's the famous battle where taxi drivers from Paris literally drove soldiers to the front line. After that, both sides just dug in, creating this unbroken line of trenches all the way from Switzerland to the sea. The war of movement was over.
We throw around the term trench warfare all the time, but let's stop for a second. What was it actually like for the millions of guys who had to live and die in those things?
Well, it was a living nightmare. Seriously, the biggest killer wasn't even bullets. It was artillery, which caused something like 60% of all casualties. And the trenches themselves were these awful mazes of mud, water, and death. Soldiers dealt with constant dampness that caused trench foot, a nasty infection that could cost you your feet. They shared their space with millions of rats. And on top of all that, there was the constant fear of poison gas, this new silent way to die.
But this wasn't just a new kind of battlefield. It was a totally new kind of war, because for the first time, that line between the soldier at the front and the civilian back home, it just started to completely disappear.
This was the dawn of what we call total war. It means exactly what it sounds like. The entire country goes to war. A nation's whole economy, its industry, its people, everything gets funneled into the war effort. Winning wasn't just up to the generals anymore. It was up to the factory workers, the farmers, the scientists. Everybody was now part of the war machine.
And all that industrial power got turned towards creating new, terrifying ways to kill. Poison gas added this whole new layer of horror. The tank was invented for one reason, to break through those trenches. And deep under the ocean, German U-boats were trying to starve Britain into surrendering. It was a war of scary, new machines.
And the war's impact just rippled out across the entire world. With the men gone, women poured into the factories. In Britain, the women working with TNT were called canaries, because the chemicals literally turned their skin yellow. The financial center of the world shifted from London to New York. And in the Middle East, Britain and France secretly drew a bunch of lines on a map, carving up the Ottoman Empire and creating a lot of the borders and problems we still see today.
So by 1918, after 4 years of absolute slaughter, the Central Powers were just
broken. The fighting was about to stop, but the conflict? Oh, it was far from over. The peace that came next would turn out to be just as destructive as the war itself.
In the spring of 1918, Germany threw everything they had left into one final, desperate offensive. And you know what? It almost worked. But then the Americans started showing up in huge numbers. Fresh troops, fresh supplies, that turned the tide. The Allied 100 Days Offensive finally broke the German army. With total collapse on the front lines and revolution breaking out back home, Germany had no choice but to sign the armistice.
But the peace that came after wasn't about healing. It was about punishment. The Treaty of Versailles took away huge chunks of German territory, completely dismantled its military, and this was the real killer. It had a war guilt clause. It forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for the war and then handed them a bill for reparations so massive it was impossible to pay. To the Germans, this wasn't a treaty. It was a diktat, a dictated peace.
And this is the absolute key to understanding what came next. Instead of actually fixing things, the treaty created this deep, bitter resentment in Germany. It fed this toxic lie, the stab-in-the-back myth, this idea that the German army was never really beaten, they were just betrayed by politicians back home. And that anger and humiliation created the perfect breeding ground for extremism.
So what was the biggest political result of the war? The complete and total destruction of the old world. I mean, just look at this. 4 incredibly powerful empires, some of which had been around for centuries, just gone, wiped off the map. And what they left behind was this giant, dangerous power vacuum right in the middle of Europe and the Middle East.
The great irony, of course, is that they called it the war to end all wars. But it really just ensured another one was coming. The botched peace, the economic chaos, all the unresolved hatred, it all just set the stage for an even bigger, even deadlier conflict, just 20 years down the road, which kind of leaves you with one last, chilling question. Did the Great War ever really end at all?